It began, as these stories so often do, not with a bang, but with a whisper. A murmur in the corridors of London's most guarded medical facilities. A quiet conversation between a senior neurologist and a discreet palisade. Then, in the way that only the most shocking revelations seem to spread, the whisper became a current, the current became a surge, and the surge became a tidal wave of speculation that no press office could contain. Prince Harry, the once carefree, rebellious second son of Diana, the young man who had smiled in the face of war-zone danger, who had walked behind his mother's coffin with eyes of stone, had received a diagnosis that would shatter the most composed of men. Advanced stress-induced neurological disorder. Words clinical in tone, devastating in reality. A condition that, according to the doctors who had examined him, had been silently gnawing away at his nervous system, accelerated by years, perhaps decades, of unrelenting emotional strain. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And yet, as the headlines began to multiply, one name kept appearing alongside his in every rumor, every speculative column, every late-night talk show monologue. Meghan, his wife. The woman who had promised him a life beyond the suffocating walls of the palace, a future of freedom and reinvention. Now, in the minds of certain observers, she was being painted as the very architect of the stress that had brought him to this moment. The story did not emerge in a single, clean announcement. There was no carefully staged press conference, no official statement bearing the royal crest. Instead, it unfolded in fragments, each one more jarring than the last. A blurry photograph of Harry leaving a private clinic in Kensington, his shoulders hunched, jaw tight, and eyes sunken. An unnamed family friend telling a tabloid that Harry had been warned to slow down or risk losing basic motor function within a few years. A leaked audio clip, the authenticity still debated, of Harry speaking in a trembling voice about needing to prepare for the worst. It was the sort of news that made even the most cynical royal watchers pause. This was no petty scandal over a book deal or a leaked text message. This was the human body, breaking down under the relentless pressure of public life and private battles. And for Harry, the stakes were even higher. A nervous system under siege, a mind carrying the weight of global scrutiny, and a marriage at the center of a media storm. But to understand how Harry reached this precipice, one cannot simply start with the diagnosis. You must go back, years back, to the slow accumulation of pressures that built like tectonic plates beneath the surface. The boyhood grief never fully processed. The army years, where adrenaline masked deeper wounds. The early days with Meghan, where love and rebellion against the establishment intertwined so tightly they became indistinguishable. And then, the rupture, the decision to leave the royal family, the interviews that turned into confessions, the lawsuits against the British press, the documentaries that exposed wounds still bleeding. Every choice Harry made in those years was publicly dissected, spun into narratives either damning or defending him. But what no one saw, or perhaps what no one wanted to see, was the toll it was taking on his body. Sleep patterns shattered by transatlantic flights and late-night strategy calls with lawyers. A constant state of vigilance, the fight-or-flight response that soldiers bring back from the battlefield but are supposed to leave behind. And the corrosive drip of stress hormones, slowly damaging the neurons that carried his thoughts, his reflexes, his very sense of self. In private, according to those closest to him, there had been signs. Subtle at first, forgetting small details in conversations, struggling to focus in meetings, a twitch in the hand that wouldn't go away, moments where his speech would slow, as if his brain needed an extra beat to catch up with his mouth. He had brushed them off at first, exhaustion, overwork, too much coffee. But the symptoms were gathering, and they were relentless. The breaking point, some insiders say, came not long after a particularly brutal round of legal wrangling with a British tabloid. The details of that confrontation will be explored later in this story, but suffice it to say that the victory Harry sought came at a cost. In the aftermath, those close to him noticed he had grown quieter, slower. It was Meghan who reportedly insisted he see a specialist, though whether out of concern or other motives is a question that lingers in the minds of critics. The appointment was made quietly, with layers of discretion. Harry entered through a side door, avoiding both photographers and curious patients. Inside, the tests began, neurological assessments, scans, and long conversations about his medical history. It was during one of these conversations that a doctor, his voice low but firm, reportedly told him, "What you are experiencing is not simply stress. It is the damage stress has done, and it is progressing faster than we'd like." From that moment, Harry's world began to shift. In the days that followed, he confided in a handful of trusted individuals, none of them, interestingly, from the inner royal circle. And here is where the story takes on the shape of something more than just a medical drama. Because according to multiple accounts, Harry began to draw connections between the events of the past 5 years and the state of his health. Between the constant media warfare, the public speaking engagements, the family estrangements, and the woman who had been beside him through all of it. It was not a simple case of blame, at least not at first. Harry's feelings, say those who know him, were tangled: love, loyalty, resentment, and fear, all swirling in ways that made him both cling to Meghan and, at times, retreat from her. But as the diagnosis sank in, the balance began to shift. The once defiant prince who had stood beside her in every battle now seemed to be taking stock of whether the battles themselves had been worth the cost. The public, of course, knew none of this at the time. All they saw were fragments: Harry skipping certain public events, Meghan appearing alone at a charity gala, the two of them photographed in tense silence at an airport. The palace, true to form, remained silent. And into that silence, the media poured speculation, some of it thoughtful, much of it cruel. Was this the beginning of Harry's retreat from public life? Was Meghan's influence finally being questioned by the man himself? What made the story resonate, and what made it dangerous for all involved, was that it wasn't just about a diagnosis. It was about the years of tension, the choices that led here, and the possibility that this could be the final act of one of the most turbulent royal stories in modern history. And now, with the truth beginning to seep out, the stage is set for a reckoning unlike any the House of Windsor has faced in decades. If this was the beginning of a goodbye, the question was, goodbye to what? His public duties? His marriage? Or something far more final? The weeks following the initial leak were a masterclass in controlled chaos. Every outlet, from the most respected broadsheets to the loudest digital tabloids, scrambled to secure exclusive angles. Some claimed to have insider knowledge of Harry's treatment plan. Others insisted they knew the true cause of his condition. In the age of instant information, speculation traveled faster than any official narrative could be crafted, and Harry was caught in the undertow. For those who had followed his life from boyhood, this wasn't the defiant, fiery-haired prince they remembered. The man photographed leaving the clinic looked thinner, weighed down, his usual defiant gaze replaced with something quieter, not fear exactly, but the kind of resignation that comes from finally understanding the scale of a battle you can't win. His steps were measured, deliberate, as if each one required more thought than it should. Behind closed doors, the conversations were far less composed. Those close to Harry say the diagnosis hit him in waves. One moment he'd be asking pointed, technical questions about treatment options. The next, he'd retreat into a deep silence, staring out at the California hills as if trying to memorize them. The medical reports were clinical in their language, but the subtext was devastating. His condition was progressive, and the stressors contributing to it needed to be minimized or removed entirely if he hoped to slow its advance. The question was, what did removing stressors mean in a life where stress had become a currency? Harry's existence for the past decade had been defined by confrontation, with the media, with the institution, even with his own blood. The last 5 years had been particularly brutal. The Megxit fallout, the Oprah interview, multiple lawsuits, strained family ties, endless public scrutiny, and a relentless work schedule packed with projects designed to prove he and Meghan could thrive outside the royal framework. In private, Harry reportedly began to voice what many had suspected but few had dared to say aloud, that his life since stepping away from royal duties had, in some ways, been more stressful than the life he'd left behind. There was freedom, yes, but also a constant need to justify that freedom, to prove his relevance, to fund the lifestyle he and Meghan had chosen. And each public appearance came with its own weight. Every speech, every interview, every deal a fresh opportunity for critics to attack. It wasn't lost on Harry that much of this pressure was tied directly to Meghan's ambitions and their joint public image. Sources say he wrestled with the guilt of even thinking it. After all, they had faced everything together. But as the symptoms grew harder to ignore, so did the nagging question. Was the cost of their shared crusade worth what it was doing to him? The press, sensing a shift, began to subtly change their framing. Where once Meghan had been portrayed solely as the outsider defying the crown, now stories emerged hinting at her role in the constant state of war that had become Harry's reality. Phrases like "a source close to the couple" and "friends of the prince" crept into coverage, suggesting internal divisions. Even Meghan's rare public appearances were dissected for signs of strain, a tight smile here, a glance away there. Meanwhile, Harry's doctors pressed for immediate lifestyle changes. Reduce travel, limit public engagements, focus on rest and recovery. In theory, it sounded simple. In practice, it meant dismantling the life he and Meghan had spent years building. Canceling appearances meant losing revenue. Stepping back from public commitments meant opening the door to rumors of weakness or retreat. And most of all, it meant confronting Meghan with the possibility that their shared vision might have to change or end. Friends who visited during this time describe a man caught between two instincts: the soldier who had been trained to push through pain, and the human being who could feel his body sending distress signals he could no longer ignore. There were moments of levity, old army mates dropping by, long walks with the dogs, but they were temporary respites from a reality that was tightening around him. One particularly telling moment came during a dinner with a small circle of confidants. According to someone present, Harry raised his glass in a quiet toast and said, "To the things we don't get to choose, and the things we do." It was cryptic, but those who knew him best understood. The diagnosis was something he hadn't chosen. What came next, whether to keep fighting the public battles or retreat into something quieter, was still within his control, at least for now. The public still had no clear picture of what was unfolding behind the scenes. What they saw were selective images. Harry and Meghan walking hand in hand in Montecito, Harry spotted alone at a beachside cafe, Meghan giving a keynote speech without him. The gaps between these moments were filled with theories, each more dramatic than the last. Some said they were preparing for a final joint project before disappearing from the public eye. Others claimed Harry was already making arrangements to return to the UK, with or without Meghan. What was certain was that the news had ignited something deeper than curiosity. For many, it was a sobering reminder that even the most privileged lives are not immune to the toll of stress and conflict. And for Harry, it was the beginning of a chapter that would force him to reckon not just with his health, but with every choice that had led him here. By the time the full scope of his condition began to emerge, it was clear this wasn't just another royal headline. This was a man facing the possibility of losing pieces of himself, physically, mentally, emotionally, in a battle he had thought was about proving his independence. Now, the stakes had shifted. The fight was no longer about reputation or legacy. It was about survival. And as he stood on the edge of that reality, one question loomed over everything. What, or who, would he be willing to let go of in order to save what was left of himself? It was a Tuesday morning in London when the first ripples began to form. The day had started like any other, the city shaking off its gray drizzle, commuters jostling on the underground, newspapers stacked neatly at corner kiosks. But inside the digital newsrooms, editors were already staring at a single line of text in their tip inboxes. Urgent. Prince Harry, serious medical condition. Developing. Within minutes, calls were being made, not to the palace press office, but to the quiet web of informants, aides, and former staffers who lived on the periphery of the royal world. The answers came hesitantly at first. "I've heard something, but it's not confirmed." And then, with growing certainty, "Yes, he's been seeing specialists. Yes, it's neurological. Yes, it's serious." By mid-morning, the first story went live on a mid-tier online outlet known for occasionally breaking royal scoops. The headline was vague enough to protect them from legal fallout, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Concerns mount over Prince Harry's health after private clinic visit. The accompanying photo, grainy, taken from a distance, showed Harry emerging from a discreet side entrance of the Kensington Medical Facility, wearing a cap pulled low and a plain navy jacket. Even so, the tension in his posture was unmistakable. That one article was all it took. Larger publications quickly followed suit, each layering on their own exclusive details. Some claimed Harry had been in and out of specialist appointments for weeks. Others reported that Meghan had been notably absent from certain visits, raising questions about the state of their relationship. A few went further, suggesting the diagnosis was tied to years of emotional trauma exacerbated by ongoing personal and legal battles. By noon, social media was ablaze. Hashtags like #PrayForHarry, #RoyalHealthCrisis, and #MeghanBacklash began trending. In online forums, theories multiplied, some sympathetic, others cruel. Loyal fans shared heartfelt messages of support, recounting how Harry's openness about mental health had inspired them. Detractors, meanwhile, used the moment to rehash every past misstep, painting the illness as either karma or a convenient excuse to disappear from the public eye. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood was far less frenetic, but no less charged. Staff who had grown accustomed to Harry's absence still felt the ripple effect of his name dominating headlines. The official stance remained predictable: we do not comment on personal medical matters. Yet behind closed doors, phones rang constantly. Courtiers sought updates from anyone who might have access to Harry's inner circle. Senior royals, including King Charles and Prince William, were said to be briefed in private, though what, exactly, they were told remains unclear. It wasn't until early evening that a more definitive report emerged, courtesy of a well-connected international news agency. This one went further, citing multiple verified sources who claimed the prince had been diagnosed with a rare, advanced stress-induced neurological disorder. The language was careful, allegedly, reportedly, but the message was unmistakable. This was not speculation anymore. This was a claim with enough weight to shift the story from gossip to serious news. The impact was immediate. Television anchors, who had spent the day dancing around vague phrases like health concerns and medical evaluations, began using the term neurological disorder on air. Health experts were invited to explain what such a diagnosis could entail. Viewers learned that stress-induced conditions could cause symptoms ranging from tremors and speech difficulties to cognitive decline, and that, in severe cases, they could progress rapidly. As the public absorbed these details, attention turned inevitably to the cause. Could years of relentless media scrutiny really lead to something this severe? Was it his military service, with its high-pressure environments, that had set the stage? Or was it, as some commentators suggested with barely concealed malice, the tumultuous life he had built with Meghan after leaving the royal fold? In Montecito, the atmosphere was no less tense. Paparazzi stationed outside the Sussex residence reported unusual activity, more cars coming and going than usual, curtains drawn tight. Meghan was seen leaving in the late afternoon, dressed in muted tones, her expression unreadable. No statement was issued from their Archwell office, no social media post to acknowledge the growing firestorm. The silence only fueled more questions. That night, a prominent American talk show host dedicated an entire segment to the story. "If the reports are true," she said, "this is a man who has lived under pressure most of us can't imagine. And if that pressure has finally caught up with him physically, it should make us all reconsider how we treat public figures, especially those brave enough to share their vulnerabilities." The monologue struck a chord, going viral across platforms, reframing the narrative for some from scandal to sympathy. But sympathy was not the only reaction. Certain tabloids across the Atlantic doubled down, running pointed headlines the next morning. "Harry's stress, self-inflicted?" And "From palace prince to public punching bag, is Meghan to blame?" These pieces highlighted moments in the past 5 years where Meghan's actions, public statements, or media projects had drawn fire, suggesting, without outright stating, that her influence was central to Harry's current state. Even among the palace's critics, there was a sense that this story was different. It wasn't about titles, money, or public duties. It was about a man's body failing under the weight of a life that had become one long, exhausting fight. And the breaking news was just the start. The deeper truth about the diagnosis, the causes, and the consequences was still to come. By the end of that week, the coverage had reached every corner of the globe. In Australia, Morning shows debated whether Harry should return to the UK for treatment. In Canada, radio hosts reflected on the country's brief chapter in his post-royal life. In South Africa, a leading newspaper ran an editorial linking his plight to broader conversations about mental health and resilience. Yet amid the noise, one thing was clear. The diagnosis had changed the tone of the conversation around Harry. The once combative public persona was now cast in a more vulnerable light, and every new detail would be filtered through the lens of a man grappling with both illness and the fallout of his own life choices. The breaking news had done more than inform the world. It had set the stage for a battle not just for Harry's health, but for control of the narrative, a battle that, in many ways, had only just begun. The phrase itself sounds clinical, almost sterile, stress-induced neurological disorder. It does not carry the same instant dread as a word like cancer or stroke. But for those who live under its shadow, it is no less life-altering. In Harry's case, it was described by medical insiders as advanced, a term that carries heavy implications. The condition has moved past the early stages where lifestyle changes might reverse it, into a phase where the focus is on slowing its progress and managing symptoms. To understand what this means, you have to break down the three key components: stress, neurological disorder. Stress, in the medical sense, is not simply feeling tense before a big speech or irritated in traffic. It is a physiological state in which the body is flooded with hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, preparing it for fight or flight. In short bursts, this is life-saving. But when it becomes constant, as it often does for those living under sustained emotional or physical pressure, it turns toxic. The body never gets the signal to stand down, and over time, those stress hormones begin to wear away at the brain and nervous system. The neurological aspect means the condition directly affects the nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. This is where the disorder earns its seriousness. Prolonged stress can disrupt the way the brain communicates with the body, causing symptoms that might mimic other illnesses. Tremors in the hands, tingling in the limbs, difficulty with speech or memory, even changes in personality or emotional regulation. In Harry's reported case, doctors believe years of heightened stress have caused measurable damage to his neural pathways, making it harder for signals to travel efficiently through his nervous system. Finally, the disorder element refers to the fact that this is not a temporary flare-up or passing ailment. It is a disruption of normal function that can persist indefinitely without intervention. And in some advanced cases, the damage cannot be fully undone. For Harry, whose public life has always demanded physical vitality and sharp mental presence, the prospect of long-term impairment is more than a health issue. It is an existential threat. Medical literature describes several variations of stress-induced neurological conditions. Some fall under the umbrella of functional neurological disorders, where the nervous system signals are disrupted without structural damage to the brain. Others are neurodegenerative in nature, meaning the brain itself shows signs of physical deterioration. From what insiders have said, Harry's situation appears to involve both functional and degenerative elements, making it more complex to treat. Doctors dealing with such cases typically focus on a combination of medical treatment, stress reduction, and therapy to manage symptoms. This can mean medication to regulate neurotransmitter activity, physiotherapy to maintain muscle function, and psychological support to address the root causes of stress. But here lies the challenge. When the source of stress is entwined with a person's very identity, career, and relationships, removing it is far from simple. For someone like Harry, the traditional medical advice: step away from your triggers, avoid high-pressure environments, seek stability, is almost impossible to follow without dismantling the life he has built. Every appearance, every speech, every headline is both an obligation and a potential aggravator. And when your stressors are people, situations, and obligations that you can't easily walk away from, treatment becomes a balancing act between managing the illness and managing the reality of who you are. Experts have noted that public figures, especially those from the world of politics or royalty, are uniquely vulnerable to stress-related neurological issues. The combination of constant public scrutiny, high-stakes decisions, and deeply personal criticism creates a feedback loop of anxiety and hypervigilance. Harry's case is particularly striking because he has spent much of his adult life in high-intensity environments. First as a soldier in Afghanistan, then as a senior royal, and finally as a high-profile figure navigating the global media landscape with Meghan. Each phase brought its own demands, but together, they formed an almost unbroken chain of pressure. Stress-induced neurological disorders are often called invisible illnesses because their symptoms may not be obvious at first glance. A man may appear perfectly healthy in public while privately struggling to steady his hands enough to sign his name. In Harry's situation, this invisibility is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it allows him to control how much of his condition the world sees. On the other, it makes it easier for critics to dismiss his illness as exaggerated or fabricated. That doubt can itself become another source of stress, compounding the problem. There is also the issue of progression. Advanced cases do not improve overnight, and without major lifestyle changes, they may worsen rapidly. This is what insiders say has Harry and his medical team most concerned. The signs, lapses in memory, moments of slowed reaction, and persistent fatigue have reportedly become more frequent. And while medication and therapy can help manage these symptoms, they cannot entirely reverse the underlying damage. One neurologist familiar with stress-related conditions, speaking in general terms and not about Harry specifically, explained it this way. Think of the nervous system like a highway. Under normal circumstances, traffic flows smoothly. Chronic stress is like constant construction work on that highway. Lanes are blocked, detours are created, and over time, parts of the road begin to crumble. The more damage, the harder it is to get traffic moving at full speed again. This analogy resonates with those who have seen Harry's recent public appearances. There are moments, subtle, but noticeable to those paying attention, where he seems to pause mid-thought, as if searching for the right word. In the fast-paced world of media appearances and public engagements, even a few seconds of hesitation can feel like an eternity. What makes Harry's reported diagnosis even more poignant is that he has long been an advocate for mental health awareness. Through initiatives like Heads Together and his own public disclosures about therapy, he has encouraged others to confront their struggles head-on. Now, he finds himself on the other side of that conversation, the one who must decide how much to reveal, how much to protect, and how to live with the knowledge that his own health may never fully return to what it was. In the coming months, his medical team will likely face difficult decisions. Do they push for a public acknowledgement of the diagnosis, in the hope that it might reduce speculation and rally support? Or do they keep the details closely guarded, allowing Harry to navigate his treatment without the added weight of media intrusion? Each option carries risks. One invites intense scrutiny, the other fuels rumor and suspicion. What is certain is that stress-induced neurological disorder is not a passing storm. It is a long-term weather system that reshapes the landscape of a person's life. For Harry, the forecast will depend on choices made now. Choices that may force him to confront not just the illness itself, but the life patterns and relationships that have sustained it. For those who had watched Harry grow from a shy, freckled boy into one of the most photographed men in the world, it was easy to imagine that he had been born into privilege and protection. But those who understood the machinery of royal life knew the truth was far more complex and far more exhausting. His life had been lived inside a pressure cooker from the moment he could walk, and it had been heating steadily ever since. The seeds of that pressure were planted in childhood. Harry's earliest memories were formed in the shadow of public fascination with his mother, Diana, whose every movement was chronicled, critiqued, and analyzed by the global press. Even as a child, he learned to smile for cameras when told, to answer questions politely, and to accept that strangers knew his name and believed they knew his story. The price of royal life was invisibility in plain sight. The public could see him, but the real him was hidden, carefully shielded by protocol. Then came the tragedy that would shape the rest of his life. At just 12 years old, he walked behind Diana's coffin, the eyes of the world upon him. That march through the streets of London was not only a public goodbye to his mother, it was his initiation into the brutal truth of life in the royal family. Personal grief is never private. While others his age were navigating the awkwardness of adolescence, Harry was learning to carry loss on a global stage. Every tear and every blink photographed, televised, and stored in the public memory forever. In the years that followed, Harry's teenage rebellion was both an act of defiance and a survival mechanism. He became the wild prince, photographed in nightclubs, caught in ill-advised moments that the press pounced on. Many saw these as youthful indiscretions. Few recognized them for what they often were: the desperate attempts of a young man to find breathing space in a life that offered none. His decision to join the military in his 20s was, in many ways, a turning point. In the army, Harry found something the palace could never give him: anonymity. Stripped of titles in the barracks, he was just another officer, subject to the same discipline and risks as his comrades. Deployment to Afghanistan gave him purpose, but it also came with a cost. War zones may harden a soldier's discipline, but they also leave invisible scars. The adrenaline, the constant vigilance, the ever-present threat, these were new forms of pressure, layered atop the unresolved grief and public scrutiny he already carried. When his military career ended, Harry faced an unexpected void. The army had provided structure, camaraderie, and a clear sense of mission. Civilian royal life felt, by comparison, stifling. Public engagements were carefully choreographed, and the role he was expected to play, dutiful, ceremonial, and deferential, often clashed with his restless spirit. Here, the pressure cooker began to tighten again. Without the sense of purpose the army had given him, he was back in a life where every move was monitored, but none of it felt like it truly mattered. Then came Meghan. At first, their relationship seemed to lift the weight from his shoulders. Meghan brought a different energy, confident, outspoken, unafraid to challenge traditions that Harry himself had long questioned. Together, they presented themselves as a modern, forward-thinking couple determined to redefine what it meant to be royal. The public reception was electric in the early days. The wedding was celebrated as a fresh chapter for the monarchy, a blending of traditions and cultures that symbolized a new era. But the honeymoon period was short-lived. Meghan's entry into the royal family became a lightning rod for criticism, from the press, from certain members of the public, and, according to some reports, from within the institution itself. Harry found himself back in familiar territory, defending someone he loved against an unrelenting barrage of media attacks. Only now, the criticism was more personal, more racially charged, and more invasive than anything he had seen before. The decision to step back from royal duties in 2020 was meant to release some of that pressure. But instead of easing, it transformed. Leaving the UK for North America didn't remove the cameras, it only changed their angle. Now Harry and Meghan were public figures on their own terms, responsible for their own income, and engaged in a constant effort to justify their departure. The interviews, the book deals, the streaming projects, each was an opportunity, but each was also a new battle. Every word they spoke was dissected. Every project was reviewed not just for its content, but for its political and personal implications. The legal battles became their own source of strain. Harry's lawsuits against British tabloids were as much about principle as they were about privacy, but they demanded energy, time, and emotional stamina. Legal documents, court appearances, and the slow grind of litigation were a far cry from the ceremonial duties he once knew. This was not the kind of fight that ended with a handshake and a photo op. It was long, drawn out, and draining. All the while, Harry's ties to his family grew more complicated. Public disagreements with his brother William, tension with his father Charles, and the lingering absence of reconciliation meant that even the personal sphere offered little refuge. Family, which for most people is a source of support in times of illness or stress, was in his case another arena of conflict. Over the years, the constant demands, from the public, from Meghan, from his own sense of justice, stacked on top of each other like weights. Sleep became irregular. The easy laughter that once defined him appeared less often. He was always on, even in private, ready to respond to the next headline or prepare for the next interview. The body can endure such pressure for a time, but not indefinitely. It is in this context that his diagnosis begins to make sense. The stress was not a sudden spike. It was a steady climb over decades, punctuated by moments of acute crisis. A childhood lived in the public eye. The trauma of loss, the strain of war, the tension of defending his wife against a global media machine, the rupture from his family, the constant, grinding need to prove himself outside the institution that defined his life. When people ask how a man like Harry, wealthy, influential, with access to the best healthcare in the world, could suffer from an advanced stress-induced neurological disorder, they often overlook the truth that the mind and body do not measure stress in material terms. Pressure is pressure, no matter the size of your bank account. And for Harry, the pressure cooker had been hissing for decades. The only question was when it would finally boil over. When Meghan Markle entered Harry's life, it was not simply the beginning of a romance. It was, in the eyes of many who knew him, the beginning of a seismic shift in the way he navigated the world. For the first time since his military days, Harry seemed to have found a partner who encouraged him to step fully into his own voice, to challenge the constraints of the institution that had both protected and imprisoned him since birth. Friends recall how he became more assertive, more willing to speak up against what he saw as injustice, particularly in the media's treatment of Meghan. But there was another side to this newfound independence. According to several individuals who have worked closely with the couple, Meghan's influence extended far beyond moral support. She reportedly played an active role in shaping the couple's public and private strategies, from the tone of their interviews to the legal battles they chose to fight. While some saw this as the natural dynamic of a strong, ambitious partnership, others, especially within the palace, saw it as destabilizing. One former royal aide, speaking anonymously, described it bluntly: Meghan changed the pace of Harry's life. He was already dealing with constant pressure, but she brought a whole new set of battles. They were battles she believed were worth fighting, but for Harry, it meant no pause, no downtime. It was one front after another. The couple's decision to leave the UK was perhaps the clearest example of Meghan's influence. While Harry had long been uneasy with royal protocol, those close to him say it was Meghan who pushed the idea of stepping back entirely. Her argument, according to sources, was that they could create a life where they were financially independent, free from the press intrusion they both despised, and able to control their narrative without palace interference. It was a vision that appealed to Harry, one that promised liberation from the constraints that had defined his existence. But independence came with its own kind of chains. The deals they signed, with streaming platforms, publishers, and public speaking agencies, were meant to provide security, but they also came with high expectations. Content had to be produced, appearances had to be made, deadlines had to be met. The work was relentless, and because much of it was tied to their personal experiences, the emotional toll was greater than a typical business venture. Every project meant rehashing the past, telling and retelling stories that were already painful to live through once. The media scrutiny also intensified, particularly toward Meghan. Her every move became a headline, her every statement dissected. For Harry, defending her became a constant mission, one that often meant placing himself directly in the line of fire. This was not simply the role of a supportive husband. It was a full-time occupation, one that left little room for rest or recovery. Friends from Harry's pre-Meghan years noticed a change. Where once he had been quick to joke and slow to anger, they began to see flashes of irritation, a shorter fuse, and a tendency to withdraw entirely when overwhelmed. Those who tried to raise concerns were met with polite but firm resistance. Harry, they say, was convinced that Meghan understood him in ways no one else ever had, and that to question her was to misunderstand him as well. Inside the palace, Meghan's influence was viewed with suspicion. Senior aides and family members, accustomed to gradual change within the institution, were unsettled by her rapid, uncompromising approach. Private meetings reportedly turned tense, with Meghan pushing for bolder moves and Harry backing her, even when it meant alienating longtime allies. It was a dynamic that reinforced their unity as a couple, but deepened their isolation from the rest of the family. There were also whispers, never confirmed, but persistent, that Meghan's vision for their life together was expansive and uncompromising, and that Harry's health was not always the priority it should have been. Sources claim that even as he began showing signs of strain, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, occasional lapses in memory, the schedule remained packed. High-profile commitments were rarely turned down, and personal downtime was often sacrificed for the next opportunity. Critics point to this as a key factor in the progression of his stress-induced neurological disorder. The body, they argue, can only endure so much before it begins to show the cracks. For Harry, the choice to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, keep producing, keep appearing in public, may have been fueled by loyalty to Meghan's shared vision, even at the expense of his own well-being. Supporters of Meghan, however, push back against this narrative. They argue that she has been Harry's greatest source of strength, the one who encouraged him to seek therapy, to speak openly about his struggles, and to stand up for himself in ways he never had before. They say the stress he faces is not the product of her influence, but of the relentless hostility they have faced as a couple from the press and from within the institution. To them, blaming Meghan is not only unfair, but misses the point entirely. The real culprit is the environment they were forced to navigate. What is undeniable is that Meghan's presence in Harry's life has been transformative, for better and for worse. She has been his partner in every sense, sharing in his victories and standing beside him in defeats. But she has also been central to the series of high-stakes decisions that have defined the past several years, decisions that have kept Harry in a near-constant state of battle readiness. For a man already carrying decades of unresolved trauma, that readiness came at a price. The question that now looms is whether that price, his health, is one he can afford to keep paying. And if the answer is no, will Meghan be willing to slow the pace, to step back from the fight, in order to save him? Every long descent into crisis has its breaking point, the moment when a slow accumulation of strain crystallizes into something irreversible. For Harry, according to those within his circle, that moment came during what began as a seemingly ordinary day in their already tense, high-profile life. It was not a staged interview, nor a red carpet appearance. It was a meeting, behind closed doors, away from the public eye, that turned into one of the most emotionally charged confrontations he had ever faced. The setting was a private suite in a central London hotel, chosen for its discretion. Harry had flown in quietly from California for a series of legal consultations related to his ongoing battle with several British tabloids. Meghan had joined him, her arrival less inconspicuous, drawing the usual flurry of attention. The meeting's purpose was to finalize a set of statements and strategies for an upcoming court date. It should have been a routine, if intense, working session. But the pressure that had been mounting over years found its outlet that day. Inside the room were legal advisors, a PR consultant, and 2 trusted aides. Harry was already visibly tense when he walked in. Pale, tired, his movements slower than usual. Those present noticed he rubbed his temples repeatedly, as if trying to stave off a headache. The discussion began formally enough, reviewing timelines and preparing for anticipated media coverage. But as the hours passed, the conversation shifted from legal facts to personal grievances. One advisor brought up the need to manage public perception more carefully, suggesting that Harry take a less confrontational approach in court to avoid further antagonizing the press. That remark, according to an aide, was the spark that set everything alight. Harry's tone sharpened. He accused the team of underestimating the damage done to his life and to Meghan's. He spoke with a speed and intensity that startled the room, his voice rising, his breathing quickening. Meghan, seated beside him, backed his position forcefully, adding her own criticisms of how their affairs had been handled in the past. Her words were precise and cutting, aimed at dismantling what she saw as a pattern of timidity and compromise. The exchange escalated, not into an argument between Harry and Meghan, but into a united front against their advisors. Yet, in the midst of that verbal battle, those closest to him saw something shift in Harry. Mid-sentence, he paused. His hands, which had been gesturing sharply, trembled. For a brief moment, he seemed unable to find the next word. The room fell silent as he sat back, eyes unfocused, breathing uneven. Meghan leaned in, speaking softly, but he didn't immediately respond. The episode lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to change the atmosphere entirely. One aide quietly suggested ending the meeting. Harry, visibly frustrated but clearly drained, agreed. The remainder of the day's work was postponed. Later that evening, he was urged to see a doctor. The appointment was booked discreetly for the following morning. Those present say the incident was not the first sign of trouble. They had noticed lapses in his concentration before. But it was the most pronounced, and it happened in a setting where no one could dismiss it as simple fatigue. The medical consultation the next day began with basic neurological assessments, but quickly expanded into more in-depth testing. By the end of the visit, the specialists expressed concern about possible neurological impairment, potentially linked to prolonged stress. They recommended further scans and a comprehensive evaluation. This was the first step in the chain of events that would lead to his diagnosis. In the days following the incident, Harry's mood reportedly shifted. He became quieter, less inclined to engage in prolonged planning sessions. For the first time, according to one insider, he seemed to question whether every battle was worth fighting. Meghan continued to advocate for a strong public stance, but even she, sources say, appeared unsettled by what had happened. She was protective, making sure his schedule was adjusted, but she did not push for a full withdrawal from their commitments. The incident quickly became a touchstone in private conversations among those who worked with the couple. Some saw it as the inevitable result of years of unrelenting pressure. Others whispered that it was a sign they were pushing themselves, and Harry, too hard. Within palace circles, the story circulated in fragments, often with a tone of grim inevitability. The prince who had fought to carve out a new life was now showing signs of being worn down by the very independence he had fought for. For Harry, the moment was more than just a physical warning. It was a psychological turning point. Those who spoke to him in the weeks after described a man beginning to measure his energy differently. He no longer assumed he could power through every confrontation, no longer treated rest as something to be stolen in small increments. But he was also reluctant to admit publicly that he might need to step back, fearing that any sign of weakness would be seized upon by those who had long predicted his downfall. What made the incident even more significant was how closely it linked the personal and the political in Harry's life. It happened in the middle of a legal strategy session, while defending himself and his wife against the institution and the media. It was, in essence, the perfect metaphor for his predicament. A man trying to fight on multiple fronts, only to find his own body joining the opposition. Looking back, those close to him now see that meeting as the moment the diagnosis became inevitable. The symptoms had been building for years, but that day made it impossible to ignore. Harry's battle was no longer just against the press, the palace, or public opinion. It was now a battle against time, against the progression of an illness that cared nothing for principles, headlines, or royal bloodlines. When the news of Harry's diagnosis began to filter into the upper tiers of the royal household, it did not arrive in the form of a formal briefing. There was no grand meeting in the palace's gilded chambers, no ceremonial announcement with handwritten notes and wax seals. Instead, it seeped through in hushed conversations between aides, private phone calls between long-serving staffers, and discreet updates relayed to the king and senior members of the family by trusted intermediaries. The first confirmed word is said to have reached King Charles during a quiet afternoon at Clarence House. The king was in between state documents when his private secretary entered with a subdued expression and a single folder. According to a source close to the palace, Charles read the initial report slowly, his face revealing little, but those who know him well say the tightening of his jaw was enough to betray his concern. The file contained summaries of Harry's recent medical consultations and the specialist's preliminary conclusions. It was clear the situation was serious, more serious than anything the family had dealt with in connection to Harry since his departure from royal duties. Charles's reaction, while not dramatic, was immediate in one respect. He instructed his team to gather more information. He wanted clarity, not just about the medical facts, but about what Harry himself understood of his condition and how much of it he intended to make public. The king's concern was genuine, but there was also the undeniable undercurrent of institutional calculation. Illness within the royal family is never just personal. It is political, it is public, and it must be managed. Prince William learned of the news not from his father, but from an aide in his own household. By the time it reached him, the details had already been embellished by whispers, and the uncertainty seemed to irritate him. Those familiar with his temperament say William's first instinct was to separate the brother from the institution, to see Harry as family before thinking of the headlines. But the gulf between them complicated any straightforward outreach. Contacting Harry meant navigating through layers of frost built up over years of mistrust, public disagreements, and private hurts. Reports suggest that William did make an initial attempt to reach out, a short, carefully worded message offering to talk whenever Harry felt ready. Whether this was met with a response remains unclear. Sources differ. Some say Harry acknowledged it, but did not follow up. Others claim he ignored it altogether, interpreting it as perfunctory rather than heartfelt. Within the wider royal circle, the reactions ranged from genuine worry to muted detachment. Princess, and ever the pragmatist, is said to have remarked that Harry's condition was unfortunate, but that he would need to make lifestyle changes if he hoped to manage it. Camilla, according to one palace insider, expressed concern for his well-being in private but avoided discussing it publicly, wary of inflaming the already sensitive relationship between the Sussexes and the rest of the family. Behind the scenes, the diagnosis triggered a series of strategic discussions. How should the palace respond if the story broke in full detail? Should they issue a statement of support, or would silence be less likely to inflame media speculation? There was also the delicate matter of public sympathy. Illness has a way of softening even the harshest public critics, and some advisors saw an opportunity to ease the narrative tension between Harry and the institution. Others warned that appearing too involved might invite scrutiny into why the palace hadn't done more to support him earlier. For the family members still working within the royal fold, Harry's situation became an unspoken backdrop to their public duties. They attended charity events, opened hospitals, and unveiled plaques, all while privately aware that one of their own was facing a potentially life-altering illness thousands of miles away. The contrast between the pomp of their daily roles and the quiet reality of Harry's health created a kind of cognitive dissonance that few spoke of openly. In Montecito, Harry's perception of the family's reaction was reportedly mixed. He was told of Charles's inquiries and William's message, but according to friends, he felt both gestures lacked urgency. Part of this was shaped by years of feeling sidelined, part by the raw defensiveness that comes when one's health becomes a subject of speculation among people with whom trust is already frayed. There was also the matter of Meghan's interpretation. Those close to the couple suggest that she viewed the palace's interest as more about managing optics than offering genuine help. She reportedly cautioned Harry to keep his distance, fearing that any information he shared could be leaked or twisted. This advice, while protective, also deepened the chasm between Harry and the rest of the family. Still, not all gestures were filtered through skepticism. A small package arrived at their California home from one of Harry's cousins. A framed photograph of Diana holding a young Harry, along with a handwritten note expressing love and support. It was a simple, personal act, unconnected to palace machinery, and it reportedly touched Harry more than any official communication he had received. Inside the palace, the diagnosis became one of those topics that everyone knew about, but few dared to discuss openly in meetings. It was too sensitive, too loaded with both personal and political implications. And so, while the public saw little change in the royal family's outward behavior, behind the formal smiles and choreographed appearances, the knowledge lingered like an unspoken weight. This was not just another controversy to be spun or silenced. It was a reminder, to Charles, to William, to everyone within those centuries-old walls, that even a prince's body can falter under the pressures of a life defined by duty, scrutiny, and relentless expectation. When the first wave of news about Harry's condition began to ripple across the globe, Meghan's name was almost immediately tied to it. This was perhaps inevitable. The two had been linked in nearly every major headline about their lives since the day their relationship became public. But in this case, the linkage carried a sharper edge. The narrative forming in certain corners of the media and online spaces was that Meghan was not only Harry's partner, but also a central player in the series of events that had led to his deteriorating health. In the early days after the leak, Meghan's public appearances were rare. She was seen once, photographed entering a wellness center in Santa Barbara wearing oversized sunglasses and an expression that made her unreadable to the cameras. Her silence was interpreted in competing ways. To her supporters, it was the dignified restraint of someone who refused to feed the gossip machine. To her critics, it was a calculated avoidance, a way to sidestep responsibility in the court of public opinion. The absence of a direct statement from Meghan became its own story. Archewell, their joint foundation, issued a brief, carefully worded release acknowledging that Harry was taking time to prioritize his health and thanking people for their concern. But there was no mention of the diagnosis, no elaboration, and no acknowledgement of the speculation surrounding the cause. For some, this was the appropriate choice. Medical matters are private, and no one should be forced to discuss them publicly. For others, the omission only fueled suspicion. Commentators began revisiting Meghan's history in the public eye, framing her through a prism of ambition and controversy. Old headlines about her interviews, business ventures, and strained family relationships were dusted off and placed alongside the current crisis, painting a picture of a woman whose presence in Harry's life had coincided with, and perhaps contributed to, a period of intense personal and public conflict. Certain tabloids leaned heavily into this framing, running side-by-side photo spreads of a smiling Meghan at glamorous events and a visibly fatigued Harry in candid shots, implying cause and effect without explicitly stating it. Yet the backlash was far from one-sided. Meghan's defenders mobilized quickly, particularly in the US, where her image was often more favorable. On social media, hashtags like #StandWithMeghan and #ProtectHarryandMeghan began trending. Supporters argued that the stress Harry endured was the product of a hostile British press, entrenched institutional resistance, and years of unresolved grief, not Meghan's influence. In their view, she had been his fiercest advocate, the one person willing to challenge the systems that had harmed him. Amid this polarized environment, Meghan faced a strategic dilemma. Remaining silent might allow the storm to pass, but it also risked letting the negative narrative take root. Speaking out could allow her to control the message, but it also carried the risk of reigniting long-standing tensions with the press and the palace. The question was not simply what she should say, but whether anything she said would be believed by those who had already decided she was to blame. Her team reportedly debated a range of options, from granting a high-profile interview to releasing a personal video statement. Ultimately, they chose a middle path, a subtle shift in her public image without directly addressing the allegations. Over the following weeks, Meghan began making low-key appearances at community events in California, often centered around mental health and wellness. Photographs of her interacting warmly with children and speaking earnestly with organizers began to surface. These appearances were not heavily promoted, but they were noticed. The imagery was clear. Meghan as a caring, engaged figure, aligned with causes that resonated with Harry's advocacy work. Still, the undercurrent of criticism remained strong in the UK media. Certain commentators accused her of using the appearances as image rehabilitation rather than genuine outreach. Some went further, speculating that her presence at these events was a way to position herself as the public face of their philanthropic efforts while Harry stepped back, ensuring that she maintained relevance even in his absence from the spotlight. This period also revealed the widening gap between how Meghan was perceived in different parts of the world. In the United States, major talk shows and celebrity outlets tended to frame her as a supportive spouse facing an unimaginably difficult situation. In the UK, especially in the tabloid press, the coverage leaned toward suspicion, with headlines suggesting that her ambitions and decisions had played a significant role in Harry's current state. The palace's silence on Meghan's role added to the complexity. While no senior royal publicly criticized her, neither did they publicly defend her. This vacuum allowed the competing narratives to grow unchecked. Supporters of the monarchy saw this as evidence that the family had distanced itself from her entirely. Meghan's advocates interpreted it as further proof of the institution's unwillingness to protect her from unfair treatment. For Meghan personally, the fallout from the diagnosis was not just about public perception, it was also about her relationship with Harry. Friends of the couple say she was deeply concerned for his health, but also frustrated by the way the illness was being used to attack her. She reportedly expressed to confidants that it felt like living the worst moments of the past all over again, a reference to the early days of their marriage when she faced intense and often personal media scrutiny. Whether or not the criticism had any grounding, the effect on Meghan's public image was undeniable. She was once again at the center of a storm she had not chosen, forced to navigate a path where every move could be interpreted as either self-serving or insincere. In many ways, the fallout from Harry's diagnosis became a referendum on Meghan herself, a battle over whether she would be seen as his greatest source of strength or as the weight he could no longer carry.